Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When trespassers in bogus uniforms knock on your door demanding entry, what do you do? For Scott Barrow, the answer was simple: defend what's his. Tucked deep in Colorado's mountains, one man's dream home became ground zero in a battle for privacy, power, and justice. My name is Scott Barrow, and at 42, I've finally built the life I've always dreamed of. Nestled deep in the picturesque mountains of Colorado, my home is more than just a place to live. It's my sanctuary, my fortress. It took years of relentless effort, numerous business ventures, and countless hours of meticulous planning to build it exactly as I envisioned. The sprawling property sits far away from the noise and intrusion of city life, surrounded by dense pine forests and rugged cliffs. My nearest neighbors are distant enough that privacy is not merely an expectation, it's a guarantee. I chose this spot precisely because it was free from oversight by any homeowners association. Nobody would ever dictate how high my grass should grow or what color my front door must be painted. This land is my domain, and within it, I am the undisputed authority. I spared no expense securing my estate. An advanced security network covers every inch of the property. Surveillance cameras silently watch the perimeter day and night, their presence subtle yet powerful. High-tech sensors detect any unusual activity long before it reaches my front door. To enhance my family's safety even further, I've contracted with ShieldGate, a premier private security firm known for rapid response and exceptional professionalism. They're on standby, prepared to handle any potential threat within minutes. For my wife, Amy, and our 2 kids, it's comforting knowing we have immediate backup just a button press away. This is a house built on confidence, tranquility, and ironclad protection. Lately, however, a hint of unease has crept in. Down in the valley below us, a new housing development has sprung up, controlled by an aggressive HOA calling itself Pine Ridge HOA. Their new president, a woman named Larson, has been making waves locally, pushing stringent guidelines, imposing hefty fines, and meddling in residents' lives. Rumor has it, she isn't content with merely managing her small neighborhood. Her ambitions extend further, possibly encroaching on those of us who chose specifically to remain free of such interference. Still, at that point, it was just background noise. Nothing more than distant thunder before a storm. It wasn't until one otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning that the rumble drew closer. I had business meetings lined up in a neighboring city, requiring me to be away from home for 2 days. Before leaving, I went through the usual routines, checking security cameras, kissing Amy and the kids goodbye, reminding them about our emergency protocols. Driving down the winding road away from my fortress, I felt reassured knowing they were secure, protected, untouchable. Little did I know, while I was away, trouble had already begun to roll toward my home, disguised behind uniforms and false authority. It was mid-afternoon on that same Tuesday when Amy first noticed something was off. She'd just finished setting the kids down for a snack when a subtle beep from the security monitor alerted her to motion at the property line. On the screen, she spotted a dark, unmarked SUV moving steadily up our private driveway. My property was remote enough that uninvited guests were rare, let alone an unknown vehicle casually driving up without prior notice. Amy's initial confusion quickly shifted to mild anxiety as the SUV stopped directly in front of the house. 3 men stepped out, each wearing matching dark blue uniforms emblazoned with bold white letters, HOA Inspection Patrol. Amy stared at the screen, puzzled. We weren't even part of any HOA. What authority could they possibly claim here? One man carried a tablet, seemingly taking notes or referencing something official-looking, while another spoke into a handheld radio. Their demeanor was purposeful, official, as though their authority was unquestionable. My wife, ever cautious yet assertive, waited, hoping they'd realize their error and simply leave. Instead, they approached our front door and began knocking with growing insistence. Amy felt a tightening in her chest but steadied herself, deciding it best to confront the situation head-on. Sliding open the kitchen window slightly, she called out firmly, "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" The man holding the tablet stepped forward, his face calm but unsmiling. "Good afternoon, ma'am. We've received an anonymous complaint alleging illegal activities taking place at this address. We need you to step outside while we conduct a visual inspection, both outside and inside the premises. Standard procedure." Amy's heart skipped a beat. Illegal activities? In our home? She knew it was absurd, a complete misunderstanding, or perhaps something worse, a deliberate fabrication. Still, these men's self-assured stance and the brazen demand made her blood run cold. "I'm sorry, but this is private property," Amy said firmly, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. "We are not part of any HOA, and I certainly haven't consented to any kind of inspection. You need to explain yourselves immediately." The man's expression hardened, the politeness in his voice evaporating into thinly veiled hostility. "Ma'am, if you refuse cooperation, we'll note your resistance and involve the authorities. It's your choice how complicated you want this to get." A shiver ran down Amy's spine. She knew that tone. It wasn't a request, it was a threat. But she'd been through emergency drills before, and she remembered exactly what to do in situations like these. Stepping away from the window, out of their line of sight, she took a deep breath, her heart hammering wildly. This wasn't going to end peacefully without backup. Amy stood motionless in the hallway for a moment, heart pounding, trying desperately to steady her nerves. Outside, she could still hear the muffled voices of the HOA patrol as they continued knocking, louder now, more forceful. Their shadows shifted impatiently behind the frosted glass panels of our front door. Amy knew she needed to act quickly. Glancing down the hall toward the children's playroom, she reassured herself silently that the kids were safe and out of sight. Then, focusing sharply, she turned toward the discrete control panel on the wall beside the staircase. I had installed a hidden emergency feature precisely for moments like this. A bright red panic button concealed behind a sliding panel and connected directly to ShieldGate, our private security service. I'd repeatedly instructed Amy that if she ever felt threatened or unsure, this was her lifeline. The response team was contractually obligated to arrive within 8 minutes of activation, no matter the circumstance. Amy slid back the panel cover without hesitation, her hand shaking slightly, and pressed the button firmly. Immediately, a soft chime resonated through the hallway, and a reassuring message appeared in illuminated green letters on the adjacent digital screen. "Security alerted. Remain inside. Assistance en route." A brief wave of relief washed over Amy. Reinforcements were coming, yet her relief was short-lived. The pounding at the front door intensified, accompanied by louder demands. "Ma'am, we know you're still in there," the voice barked aggressively. Refusing this inspection could escalate things quickly. "Open up now." Amy moved quietly to the security monitor near the front entrance. On the screen, she saw one of the men step back slightly, raising his radio, communicating something rapidly and impatiently. Another paced angrily, casting threatening glances around the exterior of our home, clearly growing agitated by the delay. Fear crept back into her mind. These men weren't backing down, and their intentions seemed dangerously unclear. Feeling her resolve harden again, Amy quickly checked the timer that appeared next to the security notification. 5 minutes left until ShieldGate's arrival. Every second felt agonizingly slow. She softly crept back toward the kitchen window, daring another careful glance outside. The leader was now directly facing the house, pointing toward windows and doors, shouting instructions to his companions, who began circling around the house. They were determined to find a way in despite Amy's explicit denial of consent. Amy's breath quickened as she stepped back again. Her protective instincts surged as she glanced toward the playroom, where the children, oblivious to the danger, played innocently. She wouldn't let these intruders harm or even frighten her family. Her eyes flashed back to the countdown. 3 more agonizing minutes. She forced herself to remain calm and silent, listening carefully to every sound outside. Then came a sudden loud rattle from the back door, jolting her into acute awareness. She gasped softly, realizing the men were testing entry points, attempting to find a way inside. It was no longer merely intimidation, it was a direct threat. Amy's heartbeat thundered in her ears as she stood her ground, silently praying for the rapid approach of ShieldGate's security team. Exactly 7 minutes and 15 seconds after Amy had activated the emergency button, a time frame that felt like an eternity, the gravel driveway erupted with the reassuring crunch of tires approaching swiftly. From her vantage near the hallway monitor, Amy glimpsed 2 sleek black ShieldGate SUVs racing up toward the house, their presence imposing and authoritative. Relief flooded through her, momentarily overriding the intense fear she'd felt only seconds ago. As the vehicles skidded to a halt near the front steps, 6 heavily equipped guards swiftly exited, each one carrying themselves with the focused precision of seasoned professionals. The large Shieldgate insignias on their tactical vests shone brightly in the afternoon sun, immediately shifting the dynamic. Amy watched silently through the front window as one guard quickly approached the 3 HOA patrolmen, his hand raised authoritatively. "Gentlemen, step back from the property immediately," the lead guard commanded firmly. His voice, calm yet unmistakably commanding, left no room for negotiation. The HOA patrolman hesitated, visibly startled by the sudden turn of events. "Who are you supposed to be?" The leader of the HOA trio snapped defiantly, trying to mask his surprise with aggression. "We're authorized personnel conducting a lawful inspection based on a credible complaint." The Shieldgate officer stood unmoving, his posture radiating an unmistakable authority. "This residence is protected private property. You are not law enforcement, nor do you have jurisdiction or authority here. I repeat, step back immediately." Tension surged visibly. Amy, still hidden safely inside, gripped the edge of the table tightly, watching the scene unfold through the video monitor. One of the HOA men, the youngest of the trio, exchanged uncertain glances with his companions, clearly uncomfortable. However, their leader doubled down, stepping closer to the Shieldgate officer, his expression belligerent. "Listen," the HOA patrol leader growled. "We're under orders from Pine Ridge HOA, and if you interfere, we'll have you arrested for obstruction." The Shieldgate officer remained unflinching, calmly raising his radio to relay the situation. "Control, we have unauthorized personnel refusing to comply, requesting immediate law enforcement backup." This seemed to ignite something in the HOA patrolman. Losing his composure, he lunged forward, aggressively grabbing the Shieldgate officer by his vest, clearly intending intimidation. It was a grave mistake. With stunning speed, the Shieldgate officer seized the man's wrist, effortlessly twisting it, spinning him around, and smoothly pinning him face down onto the driveway gravel. Amy watched in shock and awe at the seamless efficiency of the maneuver. Within seconds, the HOA leader was restrained in zip ties, his face pressed into the ground, expression a mixture of shock and humiliation. "Anyone else planning on causing trouble?" The Shieldgate officer addressed the remaining 2 patrolmen sternly. Both men, thoroughly cowed by the display of professional authority, obediently raised their hands in surrender, stepping backward slowly, clearly abandoning any idea of resistance. Amy exhaled deeply, feeling a mix of vindication and lingering anxiety. The Shieldgate officers quickly secured the scene, positioning themselves strategically around the property, clearly prepared for further escalation. One guard approached the door gently, knocking lightly. "Mrs. Barrow, this is Shieldgate Security. The situation is under control. Please remain inside until law enforcement arrives." Amy opened the door slightly, finally allowing herself to breathe fully again, nodding gratefully at the officer. Her eyes fell on the restrained HOA leader, who lay motionless on the driveway, seething silently but thoroughly defeated. Though the immediate threat had been neutralized, Amy knew this confrontation was far from over. Within 20 minutes of the confrontation, the wail of approaching sirens sliced through the mountain stillness. 2 Sheriff's Department cruisers pulled up the driveway, their lights flashing in rhythmic urgency. Amy, now seated safely with the children in the living room, watched through the front window as the officers stepped out, one middle-aged and composed, the other younger and visibly alert, hand near his holster. The Shieldgate team stood relaxed but vigilant, their formation disciplined as they awaited formal law enforcement to take over the situation. The officer in charge, a man with a steady demeanor and graying temples, approached the guard who had subdued the HOA patrol leader. "Lieutenant Mason, Shieldgate," the guard introduced himself, handing over a compact data drive. "Here's footage from our body cams, time-stamped from the moment our response was triggered. The homeowner's wife activated the emergency alert due to attempted forced entry by these 3 men. The officer nodded as he accepted the drive, then turned toward the restrained man on the gravel. "Name?" he asked. "Stephen Pike." The man grunted, trying to pull some dignity back into his voice. "I'm part of the Pine Ridge HOA Inspection Patrol. We received a complaint about suspicious activity at this address. We were doing our job." "Are you law enforcement?" the officer asked plainly, pulling a small notebook from his vest pocket. "No," Pike admitted, begrudgingly. "Do you have a warrant or any legal documentation authorizing you to enter or inspect this property?" There was a pause, and Pike's silence hung in the air like a bad smell. The other 2 patrolmen stood stiffly by the SUV, avoiding eye contact. The sheriff's deputy shook his head and let out a soft exhale. All right, we'll be taking statements from everyone, but as it stands, we've got trespassing, impersonation of public officials, and attempted unlawful entry. You'll all be coming down to the station for processing. Amy opened the door fully now, stepping out cautiously with one of the shield gate guards beside her. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear anymore, but from the adrenaline still coursing through her system. They said there were reports of illegal activity inside our home, she said firmly, voice growing stronger. But we're not part of any HOA. They demanded to search our house. One of them said if I didn't open the door, they'd escalate it. The officer nodded. That's what we figured. You're outside the jurisdiction of any homeowners association. Even if you weren't, they'd still have no right to inspect your home without your permission or a warrant. Lieutenant Mason added. One of them grabbed me when I asked them to leave. That's on camera. The HOA patrol leader, still on the ground, huffed. We were following orders. President Larson gave us the directive to expand inspection coverage. She said if the houses near the development looked like trash, it would impact property values. Amy's jaw dropped. The audacity. These weren't overzealous volunteers. They were acting under direct orders from someone with a personal agenda. President Larson, the officer repeated, eyebrows raised. She told you to patrol homes outside Pine Ridge jurisdiction? Yes, Pike muttered. She said they were technically part of the visual boundary of influence. Said if we didn't regulate the area, property values in the HOA would drop. The sheriff laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. There's no such thing as a visual boundary of influence. That's made-up nonsense. If this is coming from your HOA leadership, there's going to be hell to pay. He turned to Amy. Ma'am, would you be willing to provide a formal statement? It's clear you and your family were targeted under false pretenses, and this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was orchestrated. Absolutely, Amy replied without hesitation. While officers escorted the 3 HOA men to the cruisers, one of them trying fruitlessly to explain away his actions, Lieutenant Mason approached Amy again, his voice lowering slightly. Mrs. Barrow, your composure was impressive. You did the right thing pressing that button. I've seen situations like this escalate fast when homeowners don't act. Amy gave a tired nod. I just kept thinking about the kids. I wasn't going to let anyone step foot in here. As the cruisers pulled away, the patrolman inside looking utterly defeated, Amy stepped back toward the house, now surrounded by shield gate personnel standing like statues. But this wasn't over. Not even close. Now the questions began. How far had Larson's reach gone? What authority did she really believe she had? And what would happen when I, Scott Barrow, returned to confront this storm myself? Because the war wasn't over. It was just getting started. I arrived back at the house just as the storm was cresting. My phone had already been buzzing with messages from Amy, Shieldgate, and even the sheriff's office before I'd made it halfway home. As I pulled up the driveway and saw the red and blue strobe lights reflecting off the windows of my home, it took everything I had not to floor the accelerator. Amy met me at the front door, exhausted but steady. The kids were safe. The home unbreached, but the gravity of what had happened settled on me like the mountain air, cold, sharp, and impossible to ignore. By that evening, news outlets were already circling. A private homeowner's armed security detaining fake HOA patrols. That was the kind of headline local stations craved. By morning, it hit regional coverage. Pine Ridge HOA's name was plastered everywhere, and President Larson's smug face, screen captured from a community board meeting where she had once bragged about setting standards for the entire district, was now framed with headlines like, "Out of bounds HOA oversteps its limits." I didn't hesitate. Within 48 hours, I retained legal counsel, Ava Reiner, a seasoned property rights attorney known for dismantling abusive HOAs across the state. When I explained the details, forced inspection attempts, trespassing, threats made to my wife, and a physical altercation recorded on multiple cameras, she didn't blink. "We don't just defend," she said flatly. "We go on the offensive." Ava filed a civil suit against Pine Ridge HOA and its president personally, listing damages for trespassing, intimidation, attempted unlawful search, emotional distress, and the triggering of an emergency security response. But she didn't stop there. She requested a temporary injunction preventing the HOA from initiating any contact with properties outside their charter boundaries, citing a clear abuse of power and coordinated misconduct. The pretrial buzz was deafening. Former residents from Pine Ridge came forward anonymously, one describing secret patrol initiatives drafted by Larson, another admitting she had received warnings for yard clutter despite living on the next street over, technically beyond the HOA's control. A picture began to form. This wasn't a one-time incident. It was a pattern of illegal overreach masquerading as community management. Larson, of course, lawyered up with a bloated legal team, paid for by HOA funds, something that would later be used against her in court. Her defense hinged on one absurd argument, that while my property wasn't under Pine Ridge's jurisdiction, it visually influenced the area's aesthetic and therefore impacted home values within the community. She claimed a vague community responsibility to protect shared economic appearance. The courtroom burst into uneasy laughter the first time her attorney used that term. The judge was not amused. For nearly 2 weeks, testimony rolled in. Shield Gates officers took the stand, detailing the illegal behavior of the patrolmen and their complete lack of credentials or legal standing. The sheriff himself confirmed that Larson had no right to dispatch individuals beyond her community. Amy testified too. Strong, direct, unwavering. She described how the men pounded on the door, issued threats, and walked the perimeter like predators. Her voice didn't shake once. Then it was my turn. I told them about the years it took to build my home, the intent behind every camera, every lock, every reinforced door. I spoke of the sickening feeling of being away while my wife and kids faced down uniformed strangers making demands under false authority. I told the court this wasn't about paint colors or fences. It was about power and what happens when people believe they can extend theirs without limits. In the end, the verdict was as decisive as it was public. The court awarded us $180,000 in damages, compensation for emotional trauma, emergency security response, and reputational harm. But the real blow came with the judicial order that followed. Pine Ridge HOA was barred from any operations or initiatives outside its legal borders. Larson was removed from her position immediately, and the court opened a formal investigation into financial misuse of HOA funds, particularly those spent funding her inspection team. The media had a field day. I didn't seek out interviews, but my face still ended up on more screens than I cared for. Amy and I were hailed as the couple who stood their ground. Literally. My house had been designed as a fortress, and it had lived up to its name. But the most satisfying part, watching Larson walk out of the courthouse, silent and alone, with reporters shouting questions she could no longer bluff her way through. Justice didn't always feel this real, but that day, it did. In the weeks following the trial, the air around my home felt different, not just quieter, but charged with a kind of finality. The storm had passed, and it had left a message carved into the foundation of Pine Ridge and every other overreaching HOA paying attention. Private property is sacred. It doesn't matter how many titles you invent or what color your clipboard is. If you cross the line, there are consequences. The media eventually drifted to the next big story, but the impact of the case didn't fade. Pine Ridge HOA was no longer the unchecked authority it had once been. With Larson gone and the board under formal state audit, the community held emergency elections. To my quiet amusement, several residents who had privately reached out to us in support during the trial were now leading the charge for reform. One of them even sent us a fruit basket with a handwritten note that read, "Thank you for reminding us this isn't a dictatorship." Larson, from what I heard, had vanished into obscurity. Last I saw of her, she was dodging questions outside the courthouse, her carefully curated reputation in tatters. Rumors swirled that she'd sold her house and moved 2 states over. I didn't care where she went, as long as she never again stood on someone's porch pretending to own what she didn't. As for us, we took steps to make sure something like that would never happen again. I doubled the external surveillance around the perimeter, upgraded the smart perimeter alarms, and added license plate recognition to the main gate. Not out of fear, but out of resolve. My family's safety was never negotiable, and now it was reinforced with layers of steel, code, and law. But perhaps the most visible change was the sign I mounted at the front of the driveway. A heavy steel placard, bolted to a post sunk in concrete, black letters etched deep across its brushed surface. Do not enter without a warrant, even if you think you're with the HOA. This property is protected better than City Hall. It became something of a neighborhood legend. We started getting slow-driving looky-loos from down the valley, people pointing out their windows, whispering that this was the house from the story. I didn't mind. Let them look. Maybe they'd take the hint. Amy, bless her, handled the whole thing with more grace than I probably deserved. One evening, not long after the dust had settled, I came home to find her sitting on the back porch swing, watching the sunset with a glass of wine in her hand. I sat beside her in silence for a moment before pulling a small velvet box from my coat pocket. She raised an eyebrow as I handed it over. Inside was a custom-made gold necklace, a delicate charm in the shape of a panic button. On the back was engraved, "You saved our home and brought them all to their knees." Scott. She laughed, one of those deep, real laughs that made everything worthwhile, and leaned in close. "You really know how to turn a nightmare into a keepsake," she whispered. The kids went back to their normal routines quickly, as kids do. The fear faded, the memory softened, but not for me. Not because I couldn't move on, but because I chose not to forget. There's value in memory. Memory builds the walls of vigilance, the windows of foresight. In time, life found its rhythm again. The house stood tall, unbroken, now a symbol of something more than just architectural ambition. It was proof that there are still places in this country where your land is your land, your word is your bond, and your front door doesn't open unless you say so. Sometimes people ask if I regret it, if all the legal battles, the stress, the media circus were worth it. I tell them this: every second of it was worth hearing my wife's voice steady and fearless on the witness stand. Every dollar spent was worth watching Larson lose the power she wielded like a club. And every sleepless night paid for the peace we now live in. Because now, if anyone ever thinks about stepping onto my land with fake authority and a clipboard full of empty threats, they'll see the sign, they'll remember the story, and they'll turn around.